I spent most of my life believing that if you gave enough to family, love would always come back to you. That belief shattered the night my daughter-in-law screamed at me like I was nothing more than an unwanted guest. Her voice echoed through the house I had protected for years. What hurt even more was my son standing beside her, silent, avoiding my eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of what I sacrificed. I simply packed a bag and walked out, letting them believe they had finally pushed me out for good. They thought I was weak. They thought I had nowhere to go. What they never questioned was who truly owned the roof over their heads and how quickly quiet decisions can change everything. My name is Ruth Caldwell, and I am 71 years old. I became a widow long before my hair turned gray, and from that day forward, life taught me how to endure quietly. I worked, saved, and built stability with my own hands, never expecting praise. The house I lived in wasn't luxury, it was security, the one thing I could control in a world that kept taking from me. When my son grew up, I believed I had done my duty well. I thought respect would naturally follow sacrifice. For years, I lived simply, asking for little and offering much. By the time old age arrived, I believed my struggles were behind me. I didn't know that the hardest lesson of my life wouldn't come from loss or poverty, but from the people I trusted most. She remembered the exact day she bought the house, signing papers with trembling hands and a steady heart. It was the first time she felt truly independent after years of survival. Every room held memories of effort, late nights, unpaid overtime, and quiet prayers. When her son married, she welcomed the idea of family filling those empty spaces again. Allowing them to move in felt like the natural thing to do. She believed homes were meant to shelter families, especially in difficult beginnings. At first, everything seemed peaceful. Polite conversations, shared dinners, and promises that the arrangement was temporary. She ignored small signs of discomfort, telling herself adjustment took time. She chose patience over suspicion, unaware that kindness was slowly being mistaken for weakness. Over time, the atmosphere in the house shifted in ways she couldn't immediately explain. Conversations stopped including her. Decisions were made without asking. Simple routines she had followed for years were suddenly criticized. She told herself it was normal for younger people to want control over their space. Still, something felt wrong. The warmth she once felt walking into her own living room slowly disappeared. She began spending more time alone in her bedroom, not because she wanted solitude, but because she felt in the way. Each dismissal was small, almost unnoticeable on its own, but together they formed a heavy silence. She never confronted anyone. Instead, she reminded herself that peace was worth personal discomfort, at least for now. The first open sign of disrespect came disguised as a joke. A sharp comment about her habits, followed by laughter that didn't include her. She smiled politely, pretending it didn't sting. Later came criticism about expenses, about space, about boundaries she never knew she had crossed. She noticed her son rarely intervened. When she looked at him for reassurance, he avoided her eyes. That hurt more than the words themselves. She had raised him to be kind, yet he now chose silence over loyalty. She began questioning herself, wondering if age had made her unreasonable. Rather than argue, she adjusted, spoke less, asked less, existed less. She believed restraint would restore balance. She didn't yet understand that silence was being interpreted as surrender. As weeks passed, the house no longer felt shared, it felt claimed. Her belongings were moved without permission. Her opinions were brushed aside. Even her presence during meals felt unwelcome. She sensed growing impatience whenever she entered a room. Still, she said nothing. Years of endurance had trained her to absorb discomfort quietly. She convinced herself that speaking up would only create conflict and that harmony was more important than pride. Deep down, she hoped her son would eventually notice the imbalance and step in. Each day she waited for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge what was happening. But days turned into weeks, and silence became the loudest answer she received. The tension finally surfaced one evening when voices were raised without apology. Demands were made that crossed a line she never expected family to cross. She stood still, listening, absorbing every word. What shocked her wasn't just the hostility, it was how easily she was spoken to as if she were disposable. She glanced at her son, hoping for intervention. None came. That moment clarified everything. She realized respect had quietly vanished, replaced by entitlement. Instead of reacting emotionally, something inside her went calm. The hurt didn't disappear, but it hardened into clarity. She understood that pleading would change nothing. The situation had moved beyond misunderstanding. It had become a question of dignity, and how much of it she was willing to lose. That night she made a decision without announcing it. She didn't argue, cry, or explain herself. She packed only what she needed, moving carefully so no one noticed. Each item she folded felt symbolic, like reclaiming pieces of herself. Walking out of the house, she felt sadness, but not regret. For the first time in months, she felt in control again. They believed they had pushed her out permanently, that she had nowhere to go and no power left. What they didn't understand was that silence didn't mean defeat. It meant preparation. As she closed the door behind her, she already knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was simply the moment everything quietly began to change. The argument didn't start loudly. It sharpened slowly, like a blade being drawn. What began as complaints about money turned into personal attacks. She was called ungrateful, useless, and a burden. The words were not whispered, they were meant to hurt. Each sentence stripped away another layer of dignity. She stood there, stunned, listening as if the insults were aimed at someone else. The most painful part wasn't the cruelty itself, but how comfortably it was delivered. There was no hesitation, no remorse. This wasn't anger in the heat of the moment, it was resentment finally given permission to speak. She felt herself shrinking, not because she believed the words, but because no one stopped them. That silence gave the insults weight, making them echo long after the voices stopped. She looked to her son instinctively, the way a mother does when something feels wrong. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct a single word. His silence felt heavier than shouting. In that moment, she understood that his quiet wasn't confusion, it was a choice. He was choosing peace with his wife over fairness to his mother. That realization hurt more deeply than the insults ever could. She remembered teaching him right from wrong, standing up for himself, protecting those who were vulnerable. Now, when she needed him most, he disappeared behind silence. She didn't argue with him, she didn't ask why. The answer was already painfully clear. After that night, she began to feel invisible in the house she once managed effortlessly. Her presence no longer mattered. Conversations stopped when she entered the rooms. Decisions were made as if she didn't exist. Even her routines were treated like inconveniences. It felt as though her role had been reduced to a shadow, there but unwanted. She questioned herself constantly, wondering when she had lost her value. The years she spent raising her son, building stability, and holding the family together suddenly felt erased. It wasn't just emotional neglect, it was intentional dismissal. Each ignored glance confirmed what she already sensed. She wasn't being misunderstood. She was being deliberately pushed aside, slowly and methodically. Rather than confront the tension, she retreated inward. She spoke less, stayed out of shared spaces, and learned to move quietly. Meals were skipped, conversations avoided. This wasn't weakness, it was self-protection. She was preserving what little peace she had left. Each day, she detached emotionally, pulling away before she could be pushed further. She stopped hoping things would improve. Hope had become too expensive. Nights were spent awake, replaying moments she wished she had handled differently. Still, she didn't cry loudly or demand explanations. Years of endurance had taught her that emotional withdrawal was sometimes the only way to survive. She wasn't giving up. She was conserving strength for whatever came next. The decision to leave wasn't dramatic. It came calmly, almost gently. She waited until the house was quiet and began packing only what mattered: clothes, documents, a few personal items. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure no one noticed. Each folded piece felt like reclaiming control. She didn't pack memories, those were already heavy enough. As she zipped her bag, she felt a strange sense of relief. Leaving didn't feel like failure. It felt like stepping away from a situation that had already abandoned her. She took one last look around, not with anger, but with clarity. This place no longer recognized her worth, and she refused to beg for it. She walked out without a goodbye. No explanations, no final words. The door closed softly behind her, but the meaning was loud. She didn't want apologies or arguments. She wanted distance. As she stepped outside, the air felt lighter, even though her heart was heavy. For the first time in months, she wasn't bracing herself for disrespect. They assumed her silence meant defeat, that she would eventually return, embarrassed and dependent. They were wrong. Leaving without confrontation wasn't weakness, it was control. She chose dignity over drama. Whatever happened next would be on her terms, not theirs. That night alone, something shifted inside her. Without the constant noise of disrespect, her thoughts became clear. She realized she had spent too long measuring her worth by how much she tolerated. Sacrifice had turned into self-erasure, and love had been mistaken for endurance. She understood now that respect should never have to be earned through suffering. This realization didn't make her angry, it made her focused. She wasn't powerless. She had options she hadn't allowed herself to see before. What they believed was the end of her relevance was actually the beginning of her resolve. She didn't know exactly how things would unfold yet, but one truth was undeniable. She would never allow herself to be treated as disposable again. Sitting alone in a quiet room, she opened the folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents that represented decades of discipline and sacrifice. Every page confirmed what she already knew but needed to see again with clear eyes. The house wasn't shared. It wasn't gifted, it wasn't conditional, it was legally hers. Reading through the papers felt grounding, almost reassuring. For the first time since leaving, she didn't feel emotional, she felt precise. This wasn't about anger or revenge, it was about correcting a situation that had spiraled out of control. She carefully organized the documents, noting dates, signatures, and records of payment. Each detail strengthened her resolve. Knowledge replaced doubt, and clarity replaced fear. She finally understood how much power she still held. The next step was verification. She contacted the records office, expecting delays or complications. Instead, confirmation came quickly and without dispute. Her name stood alone on every official record. No liens, no shared claims, no legal gray areas. Hearing it spoken aloud gave her a quiet sense of victory. For months, she had been made to feel small and dependent, yet legally she stood completely independent. That realization shifted her posture and her thinking. She wasn't reacting anymore, she was directing. This wasn't impulsive, it was methodical. She asked careful questions, listened closely, and took notes. Every answer confirmed the same truth. Whatever decision she made next would be fully within her rights. No permission required, no explanations owed. She chose a realtor with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. The call was calm, professional, and brief. She didn't share personal details or emotional history, only facts. When asked about urgency, she answered honestly. Yes, she wanted to move quickly. The realtor didn't question her reasons. Instead, he focused on logistics, timelines, and market conditions. That professionalism was refreshing. For once, no one doubted her competence. She scheduled a valuation and provided the necessary paperwork. Hanging up the phone, she felt a subtle shift inside herself. This wasn't running away. This was taking action. Each step forward replaced helplessness with confidence. What once felt overwhelming now felt structured. She wasn't guessing anymore, she was executing a plan. The decision settled in quietly, without drama. Selling the house wasn't emotional, it was practical. She had already mourned what the home used to represent. What remained was an asset being misused and disrespected. Keeping it no longer served her peace. Letting it go felt like closing a chapter that had been rewritten without her consent. She didn't hesitate or second guess herself. This choice wasn't punishment, it was boundary setting in its most final form. She thought about her future, her independence, and the calm she deserved. Selling the house meant reclaiming control and redistributing power back where it belonged. Once the decision was made, she didn't look back. Regret had no place in a plan built on self-respect. The response was faster than expected. Within days, interest poured in. The market favored her timing, and the property's condition spoke for itself. Offers came with minimal negotiation, some even above asking price. Each notification reinforced that she had made the right move. She reviewed offers carefully, prioritizing speed and certainty over emotion. This wasn't about squeezing every dollar, it was about closure. The realtor handled communication, shielding her from unnecessary interaction. She felt detached in the best way possible. The house was already becoming a transaction rather than a memory. While others remained unaware of what was unfolding, she stayed focused. Momentum was building, and she intended to follow it through without hesitation. Before proceeding, she consulted a legal advisor to ensure every step was airtight. She wanted no loopholes, no misunderstandings, no room for dispute. The process was explained clearly, and each document was reviewed carefully. She asked questions, clarified timelines, and confirmed her rights. Preparation became her shield. Everything was handled quietly and professionally, with no unnecessary delays. She appreciated how the law offered structure where emotions once caused chaos. Each signature felt deliberate, not rushed. This wasn't secrecy, it was discretion. The fewer people involved, the smoother the process remained. By the end of the meeting, she felt confident. There would be no surprises. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. The final confirmation arrived without fanfare. The sale was complete, ownership transferred, funds secured, it was done. She sat still for a long moment, letting the reality settle in. There was no triumph, no bitterness, only calm. The house no longer belonged to her, and with that, a heavy emotional weight lifted. What others still believed was stability had already changed hands. She didn't announce it, she didn't warn anyone. That silence was intentional. This wasn't about shocking anyone, it was about finishing what she started. With the plan complete, she knew the next phase would unfold on its own. Consequences were already in motion, whether they were ready or not. The knock on the door came early, firm, and unfamiliar. She wasn't there to see it, but she imagined the confusion clearly. Two strangers stood outside, calm and professional, introducing themselves as the new owners. Their tone was polite, almost apologetic, but their presence carried undeniable authority. Inside, disbelief filled the space. This wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding, it was real. The house, once assumed secure, had changed hands without warning. The walls that felt permanent suddenly seemed temporary. Nothing had been stolen, yet everything felt lost. The realization crept in slowly, like cold air through an open window. Stability, once taken for granted, was no longer guaranteed. What had been ignored for months was now standing directly at the doorstep. The paper was handed over calmly, almost routinely. Legal language filled the page, leaving no room for argument or delay. An eviction notice wasn't something they had ever imagined receiving, especially not there. Hands shook as the words were read aloud. Dates, deadlines, instructions. Each line confirmed the same reality. They no longer belonged. The new owners didn't raise their voices or threaten. They didn't need to. The document spoke for them. Panic began to replace disbelief. Questions poured out, but none had satisfying answers. How could this happen so suddenly? Where would they go? The house that once felt like leverage now felt like a trap. What had been dismissed as impossible was now printed in ink, official and final. The house filled with frantic movement. Drawers were opened, papers scattered, phones searched for answers that didn't exist. Accusations flew without direction, fueled by fear rather than facts. Nothing made sense. They replayed recent weeks looking for missed signs or warnings. Surely this was some mistake. Surely it could be reversed. Panic stripped away confidence, replacing it with desperation. Every object in the house suddenly felt temporary, like it could be taken at any moment. The future they assumed was secure now looked unstable and uncertain. Fear grew louder with each unanswered question. In that chaos, one thought kept returning. Someone had known this was coming. Someone had stayed silent while everything collapsed. The call came sharp and immediate, fueled by rage and confusion. His voice was loud, demanding explanations, accusing betrayal. He spoke as if something had been stolen from him, as if a promise had been broken. There was no greeting, no concern, only blame. He wanted answers now. How could this happen? Why hadn't she said anything? Each question carried entitlement rather than reflection. He didn't ask how she was. Didn't consider why she might have acted. Anger had drowned out empathy. The call revealed more than frustration, it revealed assumptions. He believed stability was owed to him. When reality contradicted that belief, he lashed out. What he didn't realize was that his outrage arrived far too late. Shock settled differently for her. At first, she laughed, convinced it was a misunderstanding. Confidence had always protected her from doubt. But as facts replaced assumptions, disbelief cracked into panic. Her authority vanished the moment ownership was questioned. The power she thought she held dissolved instantly. Her tone shifted from commanding to defensive, from mocking to frantic. She searched for loopholes, excuses, someone else to blame. The idea that she had overplayed her hand began to sink in. The house she treated as leverage had never been hers to control. The realization hit hard and fast. For the first time, she understood that words spoken carelessly can trigger consequences that cannot be undone. Denial followed quickly. Blame was easier than accountability. They accused each other, argued over who pushed too far, who failed to act, who should have known better. Responsibility was passed back and forth like a burden no one wanted to carry. No one admitted fault. No one acknowledged disrespect. Instead, anger focused outward, searching for someone else to undo the damage. But denial couldn't erase legal truth. The more they argued, the clearer it became that the situation wasn't sudden, it was earned. Every ignored warning, every cruel word, every moment of silence had contributed. The fallout wasn't unfair, it was delayed. And now there was nowhere left to hide from it. Eventually, the truth surfaced, undeniable and complete. The house had never belonged to them. Ownership records confirmed it clearly. What they believed was security had always rested on permission, not entitlement. That realization cut deeper than anger. Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. The pieces finally connected, the quiet departure, the lack of confrontation, the sudden change. This wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. What they dismissed as weakness had been restraint. What they overlooked as passivity had been patience. The truth didn't arrive with shouting or satisfaction. It arrived calmly, leaving no room for argument. By the time they understood the full picture, the consequences were already sealed, and there was nothing left to negotiate. If you're wondering what happens next, stay with this story and subscribe, because the consequences that follow change everything. The meeting happened quietly, without shouting or drama. She listened as excuses were offered, voices shaking with regret and frustration. For the first time, she didn't interrupt or try to smooth things over. She allowed the silence to do its work. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, not angry. She explained how deeply the disrespect had cut and how long she had waited for acknowledgement. This wasn't about the house anymore. It was about being treated as disposable. Her words carried weight because they weren't fueled by rage, but by truth. No one argued back. They couldn't. Everything she said had already been proven by what had happened. The confrontation ended without raised voices, but its impact lingered far longer than shouting ever could. For the first time in years, she spoke clearly about limits. She explained what she would no longer tolerate and what access to her life would now look like. There would be no unannounced visits, no emotional manipulation, and no expectation of forgiveness without accountability. These boundaries weren't punishments, they were protections. She made it clear that respect was no longer optional. The calm certainty in her tone made it obvious this wasn't a negotiation. She wasn't asking to be understood, she was stating conditions. The dynamic shifted instantly. Where she once adjusted herself to keep peace, she now required others to meet her standards. Walking away from that conversation, she felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because she had finally chosen herself. Reality settled in slowly for them. Without the house, stability disappeared. Plans had to change. Comfort had to be sacrificed. For the first time, they experienced the consequences of entitlement without a safety net to soften the fall. She didn't celebrate their struggle or interfere in it. She simply stepped back and allowed responsibility to land where it belonged. Watching from a distance, she felt no satisfaction, only closure. Consequences weren't revenge, they were the natural result of choices made without respect. What hurt them most wasn't the loss of property, but the realization that they had pushed away the one person who had always provided stability. That understanding came too late to reverse anything, but it reshaped how they viewed their actions forever. Apologies came eventually, but they were tangled with regret rather than understanding. She accepted the words without reopening the door. Forgiveness didn't mean restoration. She made that distinction clear. Trust, once broken so deeply, couldn't be rebuilt with promises alone. She wasn't cruel, but she was firm. The relationship would remain distant, respectful, and limited. There would be no return to the way things were. This decision wasn't driven by bitterness, it was guided by self-respect. She had learned that reconciliation without change only invites repetition. Letting go of the idea of a close bond was painful, but necessary. Sometimes peace comes not from repairing what broke, but from stepping away before it breaks you again. With the chapter closed, she focused on herself. Life became simpler, quieter, and more intentional. She chose a smaller space that felt entirely her own. Every decision reflected her needs, not obligations. Mornings were calm, evenings were peaceful. There was no tension in the air, no fear of being dismissed or disrespected. Independence didn't feel lonely, it felt earned. She discovered joy in routines she had once rushed through. For the first time in years, she wasn't bracing for conflict. She was living on her own terms. That sense of control brought confidence she hadn't felt in decades. Freedom, she realized, wasn't about being alone. It was about no longer carrying weight that was never hers to bear. As time passed, she began to imagine a future that didn't revolve around sacrifice. She traveled modestly, reconnected with old friends, and explored interests she had long postponed. Each new experience reinforced the same truth: her life still held value and possibility. She no longer defined herself by what she gave up, but by what she chose. The past no longer controlled her present. She had rewritten her role, not as a caretaker waiting for gratitude, but as a woman who knew her worth. This new beginning wasn't loud or dramatic. It unfolded gently, built on clarity and self-trust. Every step forward felt intentional, as if she were finally living the life she had quietly delayed for others. In the end, peace came without vengeance. She didn't need apologies to feel whole, and she didn't need anyone to suffer for her healing to begin. What mattered was reclaiming dignity and choosing not to repeat old patterns. She looked back without resentment, understanding that walking away had been her strongest decision. The silence she once used to survive had transformed into confidence. She had proven to herself that strength didn't require cruelty. It required clarity. The story didn't end with punishment or triumph, but with balance. She moved forward unburdened, knowing she had protected herself without losing her humanity. That peace, earned, quiet, and unwavering, was the real resolution.